Hi, Shona. How are you?
Hi, Whitney. I'm fine. A little nervous, but I'm fine.
Yeah, that's normal. So, would you mind introducing yourself before sharing about your story?
Sure. So, my name is Shona. I was born and raised in Saskatchewan, third and fourth generation. And I want to talk a little bit about the overseers that were in my area all through my life. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but think that we have been gaslit in the past, and there's a lot of gaslighting going on now. And there's also a risk that we gaslight ourselves. And so I, when I put it all together, it shows a bigger picture and it's kind of wow, like, ugh. So I didn't grow up hearing the terminology overseer or head worker or senior worker or worker with responsibility or even like saint or friends. Those were all terminology that I learned later. Some overseers that I definitely knew that there was, I don't know, their name was said in a different, just a different way or whatever. But the first overseer that I remember was Willis Prop. So
Okay.
he has allegations of child sexual abuse, and he was the reason for the Alberta excommunications in the 90s. And then
Mm-hmm.
it was Dale Schultz, who has moved perpetrators around knowingly, has been very cruel to survivors, and spiritually is very spiritually abusive, really, in a
Mm-hmm.
very like he appears as a gentle giant, or did, when before I knew everything about him. And then Jack Price. And when he moved to Montana, he was overseer in Montana after. When he found out Robert Corfield was moved to his staff, and when he found out that he was a admitted child molester, he kept him on his staff. The other thing about Jack was, at the time it was just kind of this question in the back of my mind because I didn't know anything about him. Like suddenly
Mm-hmm.
he was there and people were showing him a lot of respect and kind of taking not really orders. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say about Dale Schultz was that he has that letter that where he says obey the workers even when they're wrong. So then with Jack, it
Mm-hmm.
was like never heard of him before. And suddenly he was like the big man on campus. And that was kind of weird for me. And then it was Dale Schultz again. And then I got married and moved to Arizona. And Arizona has its own overseers, but they're under California. And so at that time, it was Eldon Tenniswood was the
Okay.
overseer who has child sexual abuse allegations. And
Mm-hmm.
if you were to compile all the workers' notes, like the worker meeting notes, and he had a lot of meetings like for elders and for young people and probably for workers. And so if you were to compile all the notes that were floating out there, there'd be quite a manual of very
Mm-hmm.
legalistic of do's and don'ts of how to be a good professing person. Once he passed away, there was another worker, and then he passed away, and then it was Dale Schultz.
Mm-hmm.
And so then at that time in Arizona, Ed Alexander and Larry Greenway, when I lived there, they were the overseers. So Ed was involved in a transfer of ownership of convention grounds. This was a little bit before my time, but he was financially and spiritually abusive to the previous owners and their family. And then at the time, so Larry was in our field for 2 years. And in those years were the years that my babies were born. So he was in my home with my babies. And around that time, there was two emails that were written. And I believe they were written by Ed, but Larry's name was also on them. And one was to a convicted rapist who, after release from prison, was at some point was made elder. And at the time of the email, he had new allegations. And they were in this email, they were wanting him to go to, they wanted him to go to a therapist so that he would report to the therapist. The therapist would have to report him to the authorities and they wouldn't have to.
Mm-hmm.
And the other email was to a former worker who had allegations at the time. And they were allowing him to have stay in meetings and have full participation. So then after we moved here to North Dakota, and our overseer at the time is now in Wisconsin.
Mhm.
where there was a prison mission or a mission to a prison for pedophiles who are at once they're released were welcomed into gospel meetings and even the
Mhm.
spring to special meeting.
Mhm.
And families that weren't going to gospel meeting, parents that weren't taking their children to gospel meeting because of it, were told that they were sending their children to hell. And this is like very recent. This is like in the recent, like you would know more about it than me. And then our next overseer, he removed himself from the work 2 years ago because it came out that he had had an affair with a sister worker 20 years ago.
Mhm.
So these were the men that I thought were the most godly, the most wisest, and who cared for my soul the most.
Mhm.
And many of them were spiritually bankrupt, morally bankrupt, and others, their moral compass was way off.
Mhm.
So seeing it all laid out like that, it's just,
Mhm.
and then, to come to this point in time when we are still hearing that this is the one true ministry and that is the top guys is like, oh.
Mhm.
And in the last 2 years, I've found out that so growing up, 18 years at home, 14 of those 14, there was one, sometimes two people, workers in our field that now we know have allegations and or
Wow.
are complicit because they were in a position to do something about CSA and or they were involved in the Alberta excommunications in the 90s. So it's kind of like for me personally, I've had to take kind of a back step and say, well, like what? Because that was my parents' one thing. Like we had a lot of freedom, I guess, in how we lived, but that was the one thing we had to be meeting. That was my parents' big thing was, gospel meetings. And we often drove more than an hour for gospel meeting one way over country roads. And I've kind of second guessed telling my story because it's just part of the human experience that we are told stories about the world around us and stories about ourselves. And then we tell stories to ourselves about ourselves and about the world around us.
Mhm.
And as we grow and evolve and heal, those stories evolve too. And especially when we've been conditioned, been in a toxic, spiritual toxic environment, or even spiritual abuse, where we're told we're not worthy and that we're not enough and that there's something wrong with us, and so on. Around the age of 10 or 12, I felt that pressure. And I don't know if it was internal or external, but that I should be, professing. And I didn't. I didn't profess until I was 23.
Okay.
But I've always been made to feel that in my teenage years, I was rebellious and more like inwardly than outwardly. But I hated going to gospel meeting. I did not like meeting. I've always loved I've always loved people. So I've loved the friends. I've loved the workers, but I just did not like going to meeting. And from the time I was 12 until I was 16, we had a worker in our field that has multiple allegations of child sexual abuse. And I never liked him. He was always very smug. And I don't remember, but people have told me that there are things that he said about me, about my body, that were wildly inappropriate
Mm.
at any age, but
Mhm.
especially at that age. What I was going to say first, I have classic signs of child sexual abuse, but I don't have any memories.
Mm.
The number of perpetrators that have been through my childhood home, not just the workers in our field, but others that were there for special meeting or for whatever, or even extended family members that now we don't have allegations. There's a high chance that I have been, and a vague memory of being told that workers don't lie, like being severely reprimanded that workers do not lie. So, yeah, so I was made to feel that I was rebellious in those years. And that came from what I was hearing from gospel meetings. And I was suicidal in high school. I had gone
Wow.
through, I mean, whatever else I'd gone through, but in a transitional year, I was shunned. I would literally walk up to people and introduce myself, and they would sneer at me and turn their back and walk away.
Sure.
But out of that year, I gained some lifelong friends, some really good friends. I wasn't going to cry.
Mm.
Oh, and so then depression is something that I've had, like it's followed me all my adult life. So I left home, went to university, and I actually was living, I wasn't going to meeting, but I was living with some ladies who did. So then after a year, I dropped out of college to get married and start my family, but that relationship didn't last. And so I was devastated. And then I was out without an education and the economy was really bad. So finding work was really bad. The one job I had was I was on the road 6 days a week, 8 a.m. till like after midnight, and it was all commission. So I had like my self-esteem was almost like non-existent. I had no confidence in myself. And so then that job just like made it worse. And every one of my paychecks bounced. But it had been drilled into me that we did not quit. I mean, I showed my bounce paycheck to head office when he was criticizing my what I was wearing because it was like, well, obviously I couldn't afford anything, you know. Anyways, I ended up in another relationship that was very toxic and very verbally and emotionally, mentally abusive. Just like hammered on my self confidence and self esteem. And when I ended it, I thought he was going to kill me. And I was terrified. I was shaking. I had nowhere to go. And at that time, I was not going to meeting. I wasn't going to church. I wasn't reading. I wasn't praying. I was like 20 or 21 years of age. I can't remember. And I just, in that moment, I just prayed, God, not my will, but thine be done. And I was just instantly like flooded from head to toe with peace. I was still scared. I was still shaking, but I knew that live or die, I was going to be okay. So I moved home. But he had actually he had first canceled my movers. And then when I rebooked them and, packed up, I think it was after supper and he sent me on my way. It was winter and I was hundreds of miles from home and I had to drive through mountains. I'd driven through mountains once before that. And I had no money. And then I was scared. I was driving down this mountain road. It was curving, it was dark. I didn't know which way it was curving. And then all of a sudden I realized that he was behind me and I'm in a little car and he's in a pickup. And so you can just imagine the terror that I
Yeah.
felt.
Mhm.
And I always just, for years, I just felt that he was going to track me down. And because he couldn't have me, that nobody else could. So then I moved home and I was spending time I had my high school friends and I had, my friends that were going to meeting. I mean, they were really good for me, really good friends to this day, most of them. But again, the job situation was just a lot of dead end jobs that were really, really hard on my self esteem and self confidence. I went back to school, which was really healing, but then it was an entrepreneurial type of job. So I had to put myself
Mhm.
out there. And at that time, I was going to gospel meetings again, I think. And I was hearing a lot of messages that kind of had filtered down from Eldon Tenniswood. And things like we shouldn't have Tupperware parties because you're inviting somebody in your home and you're asking them for money to pay.
Mhm.
And for me, it was like trying to process that was that, well, if it's wrong, that was just wrong to ask people for money. So there I am, it's like inviting people into my business for my service, my product, whatever. And so I just could never really, I struggled financially all through my 20s. And also, when you're taught that not to promote yourself, I had
Mhm.
somebody help me with a resume and I couldn't even like say anything good about myself on a resume.
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
she basically had to like and do it, like write it out for me because I couldn't like I was taught that praising oneself was like praising anybody was a sin, but especially yourself, that was a
Yeah.
sin. There's probably way more that I could say about that, but there was just a lot of messages that I was getting that just were very hard for, and I had no one really to talk to and try and sort that out. I was going to say too, like I had a lot of friends, there was quite a few friends, and, we were all spiritually abused to some extent. I mean, they all kind of grew up under the same, overseers and things, but some were more spiritually wounded than others. And there was a lot of legalistic things that I picked up from them because I had messed up, like my life had been such a failure that I was trying so hard to get it right and so hard to be perfect. So then, 2 years after, I went to be baptized, and it was at convention, and they said to speak to the worker that you knew best. I could talk to my peers, but there was something, and I could talk to my clients. I had no problem, but it was like there was something about people that went to meeting that I felt threatened. And to this day, I don't really know what that is all about. But it took me a lot of courage to go and talk to somebody about being baptized. And this person made it clear that they really didn't have time for me. And
Mhm.
so they eventually did. And by that time, when they finally were able to pull themselves away from their busyness, I was just frantic, because I knew that I needed to get baptized. And so it was fine. They didn't have any problem with me being baptized. So it's the night before the baptism, and I'm in bed. The lights are out. It's in the sleeping quarters. And there's suddenly a tap on my shoulder. And there's three sister workers, and they want to talk to me. So we go off to a quiet corner. And it was the worker that I talked to and one of the sisters from the field that I'd been in, or that she'd been in my field. And neither one of them had a problem with me being baptized. But the third one was on our home visit, and she had heard some things about me that were concerning for her. So the one thing was that she'd heard that I was moving to a basement suite of a coworker of mine. And she was concerned that I was going to be hanging out with my coworker. So I had been, I was suddenly found myself without roommates, and I needed to find a place that I could afford. So just a little background here, like when I talk about being finance, like I was literally a starving artist. I was living on ramen noodles and peanut butter and my coworkers' leftovers, and digging through the trash was looking more appealing every day. And I'd stopped exercising because so I didn't need to eat as much. And so now I'm trying to find a place that's affordable, that I can afford. And what I'd been finding was things that were not in safe neighborhoods, or it could be anybody living upstairs, or it wasn't secured entry, or there was a lot of shadowy places between
Mhm.
the outside door and my door that anybody could be hiding from. Because to this day, whenever I hear a loud, like a door slam, or books fall, or that sudden sharp noise, to me, it's like a gunshot. To my body, it's a gunshot going off. Here, and to me, it was like a godsend because just one day I was feeling really anxious, but I wasn't finding a place to live, and I had to move soon. And somebody just said, "Well, why don't you check with?" It was actually a former coworker, and I'd even forgot that she had a basement suite, and so just call her. Like maybe the person that was living there moved out. And so I called, and yeah, they had just moved out. And it was in a
Wow.
safe neighborhood. It was a sweet family. Like they're a sweet family. They had two little girls, like maybe 5 and 7. It was a secure entry, and I was gonna feel safe in my home.
Mhm.
But there was a problem, like I was made to feel that that was a problem. And for years, I was afraid outside of work. I was almost afraid to even say hello to people. When you think back, was what was I afraid of? Like, I'm baptized now, like can't take that away from me. But yeah, it was just that fear that I was going to do something wrong. And and then the other thing was that she had learned that I'd been playing cards with a friend of mine. And it's always been my understanding that if we want to share the love of Christ with others, that we have to have some sort of connection with them.
Mhm.
And so I had gone to school with my friend since kindergarten, like through our first year of college. And her husband would have me over, once or, we'd have a meal, play some cards. And I had grown up with playing games. And I mean, that was what the workers did when they came. They played games with us.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of competitive rook games going on amongst the friends, at that time. And so it was all very confusing to me. And it's interesting because years later, when I was married, we were living next door to this sweet old lady, older lady, I should say. And she loved to play skip-bo. But at the back of my mind, I didn't like, I was almost afraid. Like, I didn't really like connect that until more recently, but I didn't, I mean, it would have made her so happy and so encouraged for us to come over and play skip-bo with her. But it was like, no,
Mhm.
can't play games with the world.
Oh man.
So then I was baptized. Oh, and then when I remember coming up out of the baptism waters, and I had to like kind of just stop and say, Shona, how do you feel? And then it was like that, but it was like I wasn't even allowed to feel joy,
Mhm.
and so it wasn't until like I just kind of stopped and said, hey, like how do you feel? Like I had to check in with myself, and then it was then I could feel the joy, but it was like I just felt like I could not even feel. I wasn't even allowed to feel the joy that we feel when we're baptized.
Mhm.
So the year after I was baptized, during that year, sometime I had a good friend who went through the hormone therapy and then the gender reassignment surgery.
Mhm.
And I mean, it blew my mind. Like it turned my life. I mean, it just, whoa. I mean, this was 30 years ago. It was unheard
Mhm.
of then. And there wasn't resources. There wasn't any, I mean, there wasn't the internet to go search on. Who do you talk to about it? And, for me, like what it did was it kind of sent me into my own crises. I've never questioned my orientation, but it did cause me to um, question my sexuality, which was also like, here I am, like little professing girl. I'm not supposed to be thinking about sex, right?
Mhm.
But I mean, I was in my mid 20s, and getting a little bit closer to that late third or late 20s, and wasn't dating anyone. There was nobody on the horizon, and a lot of people my age, especially in Saskatchewan, were married and had lots of kids by then at that age. And so again, it took me a lot of courage to work up. It took a lot to work up some courage to talk to a senior brother worker. He wasn't an overseer at that time, but he was kind of next in line. And it was at an inconvenient time. I'll give him that. And he did pull himself away and he gave me like a couple sentences of advice. But in the 30 years since, he has never circled back. He's never checked in to see how I was doing or how my friend was. And it and I know the time and effort that he has put in other people's concerns. And so what it did for me was it internalized that I didn't matter, which was, a thing that I've been feeling all along. It's like I don't matter, and that my problems don't matter, and that it really minimized the whole situation. And I'm glad. I mean, now I'm glad that he never circled back because I didn't want him to know anymore about anything, how I was feeling. But then uh, about in that time frame, there was another senior brother worker that wasn't an overseer then, but is now. And I don't even know how it came. I was at a friend's place and he was there. And I remember sitting at the table and he was very pleased with himself, with this, what he was about to say. Like as he was saying it, you could just tell he was so pleased with himself. But he said, psychiatry is looking for a black cat in a dark room. Psychology is looking for a black cat that doesn't exist in a dark room. So what he was saying was that if you are bipolar or schizophrenic, that you need to go see a psychiatrist. They're a doctor, you get therapy, you get medication, whatever. That's one thing. But therapy, no, that's just looking for problems that don't exist. So the other part of that story was, or that goes in there, is that at work, I was um, experiencing sexual abuse.
Oh, wow.
And I could have used some good therapy at that time.
Mhm.
And if not that, I could have used some good ministering too.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in all of those years, I just always feel like I was a shell of who I was. And nobody, like
Yeah.
there was no workers like that really ever checked in with me just to have, and probably, maybe I was kind of keeping them at a kind of sending out back off, like
Yeah.
feeling threatened vibes. But there was just a lot that I think was assumed that because I had grown up going to meetings that I I had a lot more understanding than what I did. And I grew up like believing that God was an angry, punitive God. And probably
Mhm.
wasn't until I had children that I started to, realize, like really understand the heart of God and his love for his children. I was walking to work one day, and there had been on the news, there had been another Catholic priest that had been exposed for child sexual abuse. And I thought, thank goodness that doesn't happen here. And that was
Mhm.
immediately overshadowed by the thought that happens out there, it happens in here. And that was immediately followed by the name and face of a worker. And I was like, what do you do with that? And I
Yeah.
intuitively knew that if I took that to the workers, that I would be mocked. I would be just, I would be discredited. I would be, and well, yeah, I would have been. I know that now.
Mhm.
And it wasn't long after that worker was moved, and I naively thought that it was being taken care of. So now, I guess, yeah, like I got married, I moved to Arizona, and I kind of was busy with, my own little circle and raising family and stuff. And then we moved here to North Dakota before the girls started school, just before. And small area, I mean, small rural area, small town. The closest woman that would have been my age and going through the same sort of experience, like age would have been like 35, 40 miles away.
Yeah.
So the loneliness, like often just about engulfed me. I was probably here for 10 years before I really had a friend like a
Mhm.
meeting friend.
Mhm.
And my children, like they they just didn't, like, other than, I mean, at convention, they didn't know anybody. We go to convention, they just didn't know anybody. Like even at gospel meeting, we hardly knew anybody. So when you're in that circumstance, like you have to rely on, like I made friends here in my town and really good friends.
Mhm.
But it's like when you are told all your life that it's a false church and a false doctrine and a false preacher, and that it's just human love and it's just a false peace. It's just you always feel like there's this wall between you. But at the same time, it's like when you're surrounded by all these beautiful souls, it's like, well, what could they possibly see in me that would make them want what I have? And so you're always trying to be more loving
Mhm.
and to have more joy, to be more joyful and to have greater peace. And it's exhausting and it's depressing and it's discouraging. And so, like 2 years ago, when it just suddenly, like, the veil was lifted and I saw them as they are, of having the Spirit of Christ, and that they really are praying and they really do have a relationship with God.
Mhm.
I mean, it was just a relief, a joy, um, but also a grief because I didn't recognize the Spirit of Christ within them. I denied the Spirit of Christ within them. There was a lot that happened between March of 23 and then like June, July of 23. And I'm not even going to try and figure out what it all, how I processed all of that. But it was one of my first studies was I came across this verse that said something along the line like, lest a root of bitterness springing up amongst them.
Mhm.
And I'd always been taught like people left, either because they were bitter or because they got the cares of life swept them away. But it
Mhm.
was it was like this idea that this root of bitterness was amongst us, and it was like, oh, CSA is a root of bitterness. And the covering up of it is a root of bitterness. And then like all the false doctrine, that's a root of bitterness. And there was another verse that I connected it with that I came across about the same time. And it was because of their unbelief. And so there was so many things like God is not mocked. You reap what you sow. And what is like whatever is done in darkness will be revealed. And, I mean, you just go on with all of these things that it's like, well, God is not a respecter of persons. Just all of these things. And there was like no correction at the top, like
Mhm.
amongst men. There was no correction at the top. And so I just really felt like, well, if this was the one true way, and I've been deconstructing that already because I was aware that other people felt that way. And it was like, okay, well, if I really believe that and they really believe that, then who's right? And why would God lead us astray? So when there was no correction of even that, of those things, like, or no acknowledgement of it at the top level, I just like, this isn't the true ministry,
Mhm.
and then even processing like the true ministry of Christ was the ministry that Christ did, is how he ministered. And there's the ministry of Shona, and there's the ministry of Whitney, and hopefully our
Yeah.
ministry is in alignment with Christ's ministry, but it's
Mhm.
it's it's Christ himself.
Mhm.
And so, when I realized, like, when that whole thing just kind of evaporated, it was just such a joy just to be able to meet people where they are, and instead of like always like trying to really weigh my words so that they could see that they were wrong and I was right, I mean, just to enjoy fellowship with them. It's just been such a joy. And last summer, I guess it was, I joined a local ladies Bible study at a local church. And it was open to anybody that wanted to come, any woman that wanted to come. And Habakkuk was like the book that they were studying. And I thought that was just so odd. Like, of all the books and all that I'm going through, like Habakkuk. but it was like perfect. It was absolutely the perfect study for me. I couldn't make it the first week that they started on it, so I went the next week, and I was actually late. I live like 5 minutes away, not even, and I was late. But it was like I walk around the corner, and they all kind of looked up in surprise. But it was like, but then that was like just welcome, warmth and welcome. There was no like scowls, like you're late, or frowns or anything. It was just a warm
Mhm,
welcome. And at first I wasn't well, and I had gone planning to not like say anything. I just wanted to observe, like hear
mhm.
and learn and listen. But it wasn't very long, and I just felt so at home that these ladies, they had the same heart to God or for God that I did. They went through the same struggles. They were struggling with their faith and their, envy and pride, and it was just, they had a love for their family and for people. And oh, at first I wasn't sure, like, well, what version of the Bible are you using? And they're like, it doesn't matter. And it was such a contrast to you could
Mhm.
use other Bibles as like for reference, but you had to like stick to the King James version. And it was like, no, and it just brought everything out more.
Yeah.
And when I had to go back to work, because I work at a school in August, they were still on chapter 2. And Habakkuk is only like 3 chapters long. And if I've ever studied it, Wednesday night Bible studies, it would have been like one chapter a week or all 3 chapters at once.
Mhm,
And so it was really like, I mean, we went all over the Bible. There was just so much that was brought out of that book.
mhm.
So I knew about half of these ladies. And so different successes in life, different ages, and it didn't matter. Like they all were respected and listened to and heard. And
Mhm.
and then there was several weeks in, I learned that this one lady that seemed quite knowledgeable and quite helpful and everything, that here she was a retired pastor, but
Okay.
she had never announced that. I
Yeah.
mean, it was just, I don't know, it was just heartwarming to me. So then a few weeks later, at their church, they had a special guest come in, guest speaker come in. And I don't know, he was there for 3 days or something. And my friend had invited me, but we were out of town. And then on one of the other nights, some of my meeting friends texted me and they said, "Hey, we're on our way. Do you want to join us?" So I went, and it was, just a lot of warmth and welcome. It was like the worship songs were just, I mean, just so joyful. Just people expressing their joy was just a new experience for me. Some of what he talked about was a little uncomfortable for me, but it was very timely. And
Mhm.
then and it wasn't a service, like it wasn't a church service. It was just, it was like he was just speaking. So, it's a church, so it's pews. It's not like a gospel meeting where you stack the chairs and then you have all
Mhm.
this center space, right? To visit.
Mhm.
And so, like before and during and after, there's just people that that would, nod hello or smile or wave, or, if close enough, they would talk to me. And it was like, there was just at one point, like it just really hit me like, these people have prayed for me.
Mhm.
And some of it was because of our connection outside of church, just in the community. But it was like, these people prayed for me. They prayed for my family, because so much of my like growing up experience with, and even after I professed, and I haven't gone back and looked, but there is a lot of the names like Merlin Effect, Dale Schultz, Robert Corfield, Jack Radicott, Jim Atchison. Those were my workers in
Mhm.
those years, like either in where I was living or where my parents were. And I was often home on the weekend. And so I'd go to gospel meeting with my parents. So it's like I've just kind of had to take a step back from, like, I've bought 2 new Bibles. Um,
Mhm.
One was a cultural study Bible, But I've just, and even like, because for so much of my life, it was like, you have to read and pray. Like if you're not like down on your bed, kneeling, praying, it doesn't count, and that,
Mm,
like, I mean, you can pray elsewhere otherwise, but you have to kneel by your bed or it doesn't count. And,
yeah.
twice a day, morning and night. And so even that, like, I've just kind of have to just rest in God and,
Mm-hmm.
just enjoy that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm slowly like working my way into getting back because I loved reading the Bible. Like
Yeah.
when my kids became school age, I when after I got them off to school, like I would sit with my coffee and I'd read my Bible. And sometimes it would be, oh, whoops, it's lunchtime. So,
Yeah.
but now it's like I almost grew an aversion to it. So see, like relearning like what it really means and getting back into that love and desire, but also just knowing that the Bible is a collection of people's stories of their experience with God.
Yeah.
And so your and my stories and our experience with God are just as important. They're just as of much value. And
Mm-hmm.
that really sometimes like our Bibles almost become an idol. I mean, of course, the story of Jesus and the story of God is very important.
Mm-hmm.
But to place more important on one person in the Bible story over our own is when this crisis first became known. I spent a lot of time talking with people, like people that I'd never, met before. And sometimes like one conversation would be hours. Like I think the record was 8 hours that I would like in one conversation with somebody that never met before or had only briefly known.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at some point, so I work as a para at our school and I'm in general education. So, and then I also substitute at the daycare. So on a given day, I can be up to like in contact with like up to 150 kids under the
Mm-hmm.
age of, I don't know, 10 or whatever. And so that's kind of been my focus is loving on them and hopefully
Mm-hmm.
preventing because
Yeah.
I mean, the statistics are not good,
Yeah.
right? I've spent a lot of time with advocates, I think, like being
Mm-hmm.
strengthening and encouraging one another because um, the first, like in 23, right after it all kind of came out, like Dean Brewer came out and then our overseers removed himself and then our workers went off to convention. And so I went to a weekend of that and I really didn't know what the workers were saying.
Mm-hmm.
I really didn't know like what are you like, are you for perpetrators or are you for like I really didn't know what they were. And then I went to what would have been my home convention growing up. I was there for a day with my parents and it was like I had no idea. Like I knew one friend there that she was aware and that she was safe. And since then, I mean, there's been a lot of people that have become aware
Mm-hmm.
and have said, no, this is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then at our convention here that year, I'd been listening in, and there was the four visiting senior workers were guest keynote speakers, whatever you want to call them. One of them, I have no idea what he shared because I didn't hear his first message. And then the second one, I was so distraught by the message that was shared before that I couldn't even like focus on what he was saying. But I had gone to that convention hoping for some balm because, there was so many people, there were so many stories, and you just get so weird. Like, I mean, it's just, I was hoping for some balm. And what I got was basically felt like sandpaper on gaping
Mm-hmm.
wounds. But it was an eye opener. Like I had a lot of people that, we just look at each other and like, wow, like, did we really hear that or not hear that? Like,
Mm-hmm.
has it always been like that? You know?
Yeah.
And the one thing that I wanted to say too was that about 6 months after stopping going to gospel meeting, I kind of stopped and I thought, I can't remember the last time I've been curled up feeling like that my life was useless. It was about 2019 that I was going through a really low period, and I kind of tuned into what was going on in the background of my mind. And it was that line of a hymn, I died your soul to save. And I realized, in God's eyes, I am worth the blood of his son.
Hmm.
In Jesus, I was worth dying for. That's my
Hmm.
worth.
Hmm.
We're conditioned that we're not worthy.
Right.
And we're trained to like look for all the ways that we're not worthy. But our worth is the blood of
Hmm.
Jesus. And
Yes. It's beautiful. I'm so glad you're willing to share your story because even as you're talking about it, it's like this story is so worthy of being shared. And you, Shona, are so worthy of sharing your voice, sharing your perspective. And I love when you talk about your women's Bible studies, that warmth and welcome. I'm so thrilled to hear that you have a welcoming community that values you now. I love that.
yeah. And I want to say, Whitney, like, thank you so much for, sharing this space. It is so important. Like people need that space to share their voice, to be heard.
Mhm.
And that's where
Mhm.
true healing comes, is when, like, even as I've thought of this story, like and sharing it, like there's other things that come to mind that, need unpacking. But it's like,
Mhm.
because we tell those stories, and so suddenly it's like, oh, well, now I can process that, and
Mhm.
see what, like, get a story that's closer to what's true.
Yeah.
And I want to say, like, I do truly believe that there are many workers who
Mhm.
are very sincere. And I look back on different parts of my life and I think, wow, like that was where they were, where I needed them to be, because things could have turned out very differently for
Mm.
me had they
Mhm.
not been there. And
Mhm.
just and almost inconsequential, but just, oh, I think that was a
Yeah.
God thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I value this hour that you've shared your story because it's meant a lot to me just to listen to it, to hear where you're coming from, to understand a little bit better about the impact of, like, even you're talking about at the end where Jesus values us as worthy. Like, that's just so, so beautiful to hear again. Thank you for sharing
Mhm.
that with me.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, I hope you have a really good day, Shona.
Thanks. You too. Bye.